What is your axis mundi? That is, what is your place in the world? Everyone has one. How do you interpret and then re-encrypt the past in a way that is useful to your present and to the future? A future which is continuously breaking open every second before you. Your axis mundi, your existential cartographical orientation point of your place in the cosmos, really. Your axis mundi includes your stance on God and divine generosity, on the human being or theological anthropology, on our purpose for being here or teleology, and of course on epiphany or divine revelation, which is to say how God communicates with human beings. These four are essential to theology: God, humanity, purpose, and communication. And there is at least one more for our consideration in this lecture today. That is, finally, your axis mundi must take into consideration this other matter of theodicy. Theodicy is a classic theological term we use to ask the question about how we render meaningful the character and righteousness of God in light of the pain God's creation endures in general terms and the human suffering which takes place in specific terms. The theological question of theodicy is not a defense of God. It is and always will remain a question, from Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov to Descartes' interpretation of the yearning of the cogito ergo sum, which literally means, I think therefore I am, or from the American indigenous to the Armenian genocides. The denial of suffering unmakes the credibility of theology to respond. Thus, the theological challenge of theodicy is a question for self-reflective human consciousness, directed like a beam into the universe, akin to the Very Large Array, as it's called, of 27 radio antennas in Socorro, New Mexico, not far from my childhood home. Theologians through the ages are reflecting, listening, and interpreting the response of the sacred to this challenge of theodicy. And that act of listening, for you, for us, for your axis mundi, of seeking a response to the question of theodicy, is reliant on the matter of an epiphany from the sacred, or say, of divine revelation. And divine revelation reveals a response to suffering and a deeper insight into how the divine is at work in a cosmic order all around us. So we'll begin here with the matter of divine revelation first, and then we'll move to suffering, remembering that as we discuss revelation, we mean God's response to suffering and deeper insight into what God desires for the cosmos before us. Now, there are two forms of revelation that we often refer to, and which are in our popular speak, but which we can identify here. And these two forms are general revelation and special revelation. General revelation focuses on the cosmogenesis of the universe. And by cosmogenesis, I mean beginning with the deist, pantheist, or panentheist lens of God who creates in the past, still creates in the present toward the future. And you are to be participatory co-creators in furthering God's revelation in the world today and tomorrow. Special revelation is just as it sounds. Yes, God has created the cosmos, but there is a special or particular message to humanity and even to the cosmos itself. The message is delivered to a specific or particular community, be that Christian, Jewish, Muslim, or other. Or one might even add the spirits or gods. The spirits or gods are within the cosmos, guiding our lives, although perhaps we're not part of the created order. In either event, my life, your life, is a response to the inbreaking of special revelation into the world. And Christians will refer to Christ as the special revelation of God's act of righteousness, or God's act of salvation, let's say, within the universe. But if we practice theological humility, then we can account for revelatory imports across religious systems. And we can also account for the creative, imaginative aspect of the human capacity as a signal of divine revelation. In this matter, I should say, of Schwimm and Berry, are they correct that even the shamanic quality of imagination is a form of participation and evolution and a quality of revelation in the universe? If so, then Descartes, Newton, Einstein, as well as Teresa von Avila, Hannah Arendt, and others are all participating in the imaginative engagement in the universe of revelation. Now, we're accustomed to the human imagination, so we take it for normative, mundane in the world. It's not necessarily accounting, we're not, for its creative force. But imagination brought us Ptolemy and Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton. All of our discoveries as a species, in fact, begin with the question, at the limit of what is known in the present, in hopes of cracking open the future. There's really nothing mundane about imagination. Consider this. As far as we know, at least based on scientific evidence to date, we are the only beings in the universe with this capacity to imagine, as we do, self-consciously and self-aware. And even if we are not, the most likely closest intelligent life form to us is a full 4 light years away from our small planet. My point, there's nothing normative or mundane about human imagination. In fact, it's a tremendous lack of imagination on our part to think that imagination itself is normative. Imagination is participating in the unfolding cosmogenesis, or the great evolutionary liturgy of the universe, as our reading calls it. Cosmogenesis is a theory of the universe that's evident in our reading, which suggests that there are conclusions drawn about the universe all around us. Here they are. First, the cosmos was never static. We know that now. We have treated the universe as a kind of big, lumbering, stable thing, a perfect platonic circle, unchanged, unmoving, and perfect. Instead, as an alternative to this interpretation, science is showing us that the universe is evolving. The evolution from our 14 billion years to our historic, now Anthropocene moment today is a narrative which humans or beings are both living into fully as an expression of the universe. Consciousness itself is a form of mystery becoming self-aware, where human beings in the universe become aware through the universe of its own being. Revelation is more than pinpointing the locus of God, or of how God illumines or directly dialogues with human beings. For Hout, revelation is about God's gift of God's own self to the world. And this is not Hout's, I should say, original discovery. Our earlier reflection on kenosis in Module 1 is at work in this description of revelation as gift and is drawn from the richest traditions of the major world religions today. Consider an image of revelation as a gift of God's self to the world in the Hebrew Talmud. In this Talmudic narrative, we see an instance of God's self-emptying, this is the kenosis part you're hearing, where God enters into the field of human limitation. Remember that from Module 1, limitation. That is to say, God enters into space and time. In the narrative, the divine, or God, is tired of spending God's entire being alone in transcendence, that is, so fully outside of space and time. This loneliness becomes unbearable. So one day, the loneliness of God grows to distraction, and God decides to create space and time, with all the stars and all the planets as accessories whirling around in the sky. Through creation, God steps into space and time in order to produce for himself or herself a very special creation, that is self-reflective consciousness itself, the breath of life, humanity. God introduces God's self to humanity, and there enters the tragedy. So evident in the cross-religious telling of narratives like this around the world, the multiple stories of brotherly fratricide, for instance, in religious literature. Well, the relationship between humanity and God undergoes a breach of one kind or another, typically due to human disobedience or pride or lust or some sort of combination of these and more. Now pan back once more to God. Now, the creator of the universe is lonely, or alone, inside of space and time, and yet also lonely outside of time. The Talmudic religious telling of divine immanence in time and transcendence out of time involves a double bind of loneliness and isolation In the Talmudic retelling, revelation is the gift of God's self to the world, but it doesn't always work out as Haut or one might hope. What happens when there isn't a receptive audience? Now, both Haut and the Talmud, what they're doing, however, is to provide an alternative view of God the Creator. Now, that's helpful. That isn't limited by a Neoplatonic understanding of God that grew up in early Christianity. In a Neoplatonic conceptualization of God, which greatly impacted the Christian medieval theological tradition, God has at least 4 qualities. These are omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, and omnipresence, which is to say, in each of these, God is all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving, and all-present. If you wonder how beholden you are to these categories, reflect on how uneasy you may have felt at the idea a moment ago with the idea of God being lonely. A perfect God is not lonely, let's say. Thank the Neoplatonists for that perspective. Western Christian theology struggle to think about the relational aspects of the sacred in the universe because we have a tendency to have these 4 qualities always before us and the immovability or stasis or predictability of God that's attached to it. But what if we thought of revelation differently? In our readings, Haut wants to construct a viable natural theology whereby revelation does 2 things well. First, it does not interrupt the laws of physics, and second, at the same time, it allows to show the limitations of science. In the first case, revelation is eruption, not an interruption of nature. And in the second case, divine revelation answers limit questions about our humanity that science cannot answer. Theology, for instance, asks why, whereas science responds with the descriptive realm of how. By example, how does cancer invade its host body and end the life cycle? Well, science quests for viable responses to this question. Why does the child with brain cancer or the adult with autoimmune disorder suffer with these diseases? Theology has a proper domain in this response and must exercise its response in ways that are true, relevant, and pastoral to the moment, or lose its credible voice. The question of human suffering, in light of the concept of both revelation, where God speaks, and cosmogenesis, how the universe evolves, does not diminish. Suffering does not diminish. Now, having said this, general and special revelation do respond to suffering. For instance, in the book of Job, the protagonist Job undergoes tremendous suffering. Although he's done nothing wrong, Job questions God about how the faithful servant could be so sorely treated. God gives Job a divine lesson in geology. Where were you when I created the cosmos, God asks. In one of the most brilliant classical prose in all of sacred scripture, what we find in Job is the human imagination at work. The writers of the book are responding to a breach between God's plan for the cosmos and the reality of human suffering. Jesus on the cross in the book of Mark responds to suffering as well. Father, why have you abandoned me? This is often interpreted as Jesus' pure identification with the pain and suffering of human beings, including the psychological and emotional sense of abandonment when one is left to suffering. John Haut notes that, quote, our being is essentially cosmic as well as communal, and even in our aloneness, each of us is tied to the universe itself. Yes, we suffer, but we're never not connected, is what he's saying, through general and special revelation to the sacred in the cosmos. That's Haut's point. And yet, I'll be honest and tell you that something about this feels awry to me in the theological response provided by Haut and others. I'm hoping that in the stellar observation, you too lend your voices for consideration. Some of the most profound theological conversations in my life have taken place around a surplus of what T.S. Eliot calls coffee spoons. Unplanned theological conversations around coffee or the like. In those conversations that you have had too, with friends or family, with colleagues, we discuss together, don't we, the pains and suffering of our own humanity. It reminds me of those conversations in this time with you right now, of Ceres, the dwarf planet that we visited last summer on the way to Pluto. Now, up close, the surface of the planet looks like a war had taken place and then both armies left it for its own desolation. Analogous to human suffering, sometimes life does feel like the planet Ceres, as you'll learn in the stellar observations. That is to say, millions of human beings stand outside the privilege of a warming sun and the gravitational pull of societal structures that assist them. Millions fall outside the orbit of flourishing life, and millions more can feel like Ceres, with external crust that is pocked by a history of asteroidal impact or a stray, unanticipated comet like a bolt from the blue. Hout's appeal to a universal connection in light of significant suffering and desolation is precisely what appears absent in his account. Human beings do suffer, feel desperate, feel abandoned and afraid, and not everything feels like gratitude toward divine generosity, and that's important to remember. Any theological response to the evolution of the cosmos, cosmogenesis, or to the voice of the sacred, revelation, must grapple with our fullest experience of being human, which includes especially suffering. Otherwise, theological insight will parade as jargon, and its inability to take suffering seriously will prove both the direct opposite of its intentions and suffer a loss in credibility. With this lecture in mind, move now to the readings for the module, if you haven't already. These authors provide insight on Revelation, which is rich for all of your reading, and I wanted you to see the problem of suffering as well. Any account of Revelation that dismisses misery is itself missing the mark. And then move to stellar observations. Ceres, Life as a Lonely Planet, as it's titled. I look forward to reading your responses therein, including your reflections on loneliness from St. John of the Cross. Remember as well that you should start working on your paper, which is due on Monday, July 18th. You'll find the paper description in the rubric for the upload button on Module 4. Now's the time, if you have any questions of the paper, to be in conversation with me. If you want to know how I'm going to grade the paper, pay close attention to the rubric. I'm confident you'll do well, but your prep will make a difference. So make sure you also assess the How to Write a Stellar Paper waiting for you. It's a document in the orientation of the course. I look forward to our continued conversations. Reach out to me with any questions or reflections. I'll see you soon.